$2 million. That was my grandmother's gift to me, something she said would keep me safe no matter what life threw my way. I never imagined my own sister would be the one to take it, and she didn't do it alone. She had help from the one person I thought I'd left behind for good, my ex-husband. Together they stood in court, told lies about my mental health, and made sure the judge saw me as unfit to handle my own inheritance. By the time it was over, they had the house, the trust fund, and my grandmother's ring on her finger. People whispered friends pulled away, and in this city, reputation is worth more than money. For a while, I stayed quiet. They believed that meant they had won. But my grandmother knew exactly what they were capable of, and she left me something they could never see coming. I just had to wait for the right moment. I was stirring my coffee when the door of the cafe swung open and a gust of cold Charleston air rushed in. Vanessa walked in like she owned the place, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, her perfect hair catching the light. Her left hand was raised just high enough for everyone to notice the diamond glinting on her finger. My grandmother's ring. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on me, and then crossed over, sliding into the seat across from mine with that calculated smirk I had known my whole life. "Thanks for meeting me, Claire," she said in that honeyed tone that always meant trouble. "I wanted you to be the first to know. Ryan and I are engaged." My fingers tightened around my cup, the heat biting into my palms. Ryan Caldwell. My ex-husband. I forced my expression to remain neutral, the same mask I had worn in court when they painted me as unstable. She sat back, enjoying the silence like it was another weapon. Her nails tapped the side of her cup in a slow, steady rhythm. "I see you noticed the ring," she added, lifting her hand higher. "Well, since Ryan helped me contest the will, it's legally mine now. Along with the house and, of course, the trust fund. $2 million, Claire. Isn't it funny how things work out?" I remembered the weight of my grandmother Eleanor's hands the last time I saw her, how fragile her skin looked against the deep brown leather of the journal she pressed into my palms. "Keep this safe," she whispered, her breath shallow. "Wait for the right moment." I had promised, not knowing exactly why, only that her eyes told me it mattered. That journal was now locked in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, its pages holding secrets Vanessa could never imagine. Vanessa leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to draw me in. "You know, it wasn't even that hard. A few stories about your panic attacks, some edited photos, Ryan backing me up in court." The judge didn't even blink. She let the words hang there as if proud of the cruelty. She had taken my lowest moments, the panic I had felt after discovering Ryan's affairs, and turned them into a weapon. A weapon sharp enough to cut me out of my own inheritance. "Why are you telling me this, Vanessa?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. "Just to gloat." "Oh no, dear sister," she said, tilting her head. "I wanted to offer you something. Sign away any future claims to the estate, and I'll give you a monthly allowance. Enough so you won't end up on the street. After all, we're family." I looked at her, really looked at her. The flawless makeup, the designer coat, the bright diamond that didn't belong to her. All of it was armor carefully chosen to hide what I had seen in her since we were kids, a desperate need to win even if it meant destroying someone else. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't move. Instead, I imagined the journal in my desk, the pages detailing the assets my grandmother had moved, the clauses that would lock Vanessa out completely. I had read every line the night before and realized that maybe this was the moment my grandmother had meant. "That's generous of you," I said softly. "But you might want to hold on to that offer. Things have a way of changing." She frowned, not used to me pushing back. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying me for cracks. I didn't give her any. "You always were stubborn," she said, standing up and adjusting her coat. "I'll give you a week to think about it. After that, the offer is gone." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to flash the ring again under the cafe lights. I stayed at the table staring at the ripples in my untouched coffee. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air, but it did nothing to warm me. My mind replayed her words, the smug tilt of her head, the way she thought she had already won. Outside, her car engine started, the sound fading as she pulled away. I finished my coffee slowly, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. $2 million. My grandmother's legacy. and a sister who had built her victory on lies. I took a deep breath, stood, and pulled on my coat. The journal was waiting at home, and so was the plan that would take everything back. The wind off the harbor cut through my coat as I walked the few blocks home, the kind of sharp December chill that always seemed to find its way into your bones. Inside my townhouse, the air was still almost expectant. I went straight to my desk in the corner of the living room and unlocked the bottom drawer. The leather journal was exactly where I had left it, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. My fingers traced the edge before I opened it, and the memory of the day it came into my possession unfolded in my mind. It had been late afternoon in the spring of 2022. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows of my grandmother Eleanor's library, casting gold across the rows of books she loved. The scent of old paper and lemon polish filled the room. She was sitting in her favorite chair, a wool blanket over her lap, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her voice had been softer than I'd ever heard it when she asked me to sit. She reached to the side table and picked up a journal bound in deep brown leather. It looked older than me, with scuffed corners and faint ink stains along the edges. She placed it in my hands, her fingers cool and fragile but steady. "Keep this safe," she told me. "Do not open it until the time is right. Promise me, Claire." I had promised. At the time, I thought it was a sentimental keepsake, maybe a record of her childhood or her thoughts in the final years. But there had been something in her eyes, a seriousness that made me swallow any questions. We sat for a while after that, her hand resting on mine, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound. 2 months later, she was gone. It wasn't until last night that I finally turned the key and broke my promise. The pages were filled with precise, elegant handwriting lines of figures, dates, property descriptions. Every asset my grandmother truly valued was listed there. A commercial building in Savannah, a small marina on the St. Johns River, a collection of paintings by regional artists that I knew were worth more than most houses on the Battery. Together, they totaled just over $2 million, moved into a second trust in October 2021. And there was the clause that made my heart catch. Neither sister could touch a cent without the consent of the other. She had built a wall that Vanessa could not climb alone. The sound of my phone vibrating on the counter pulled me back to the present. It was a message from my aunt inviting me to Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Vanessa would be there. I almost declined, then thought better of it. Seeing her in a room where she thought she had the upper hand might tell me more than any lawyer could. That Sunday, the dining room was warm and bright, the long table set with china that had been in the family for decades. My father poured wine while my mother carried in a roast. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes late, the ring glinting again as she shrugged off her coat. She was all smiles, air-kissing relatives, filling the space with her voice. Ryan was nowhere in sight, which was no surprise. He had always been careful about when to appear. Midway through the meal, as the conversation drifted to the holidays, Vanessa turned to me with a sweetly curious look. "Have you sorted through what Grandma left you, Claire?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. I set down my fork, feeling every pair of eyes turn my way. There was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth, the same look she used to have when she baited me into trouble as a kid. I smiled, taking a sip of wine. There wasn't much to sort through. A few personal items. She nodded slowly, pretending to be sympathetic. "Well, she left me quite a bit, you know. It's been life-changing." I could feel my parents watching, waiting to see if I would take the bait. Instead, I leaned back, letting her fill the silence with her own pride. "That's wonderful," I said finally. "Grandma always wanted you to be happy." The flicker of frustration in her eyes was quick, but I caught it. She had expected me to snap, to show my hand. Instead, I passed the bread basket to my uncle and asked about his new boat. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of small talk and polite laughter. I kept my focus on listening, noting who deferred to Vanessa, who avoided her gaze, and who seemed to be genuinely unaware of the tension between us. When coffee was served, I excused myself, slipping out into the crisp night air before anyone could suggest lingering. Back at home, I returned the journal to its drawer, locking it again. My grandmother had trusted me to wait, to use what she left behind, not in anger but in precision. Tonight had confirmed what I already suspected. Vanessa was fishing, hoping to confirm that I knew nothing. And for now, that was exactly what she would believe. I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the street lamps throw pale circles onto the empty sidewalk. The city was quiet, and so was I, holding the weight of $2 million in my hands without ever touching the money. The right moment was coming. I could feel it. It had been 4 years since my divorce, but some wounds still stung like they had been cut yesterday. In the fall of 2019, just weeks after Ryan and I signed the papers, the whispers started. At first, they were subtle. A canceled lunch meeting, a polite email from a potential client saying they had decided to go in another direction. I thought it was just the ebb and flow of business. Then I began to notice the looks, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. Vanessa had always been social, always knew how to work a room. Paired with Ryan, she had the perfect partner for a smear campaign. They told people I was unstable, that I had breakdowns during our marriage. Ryan apparently spoke about the toll my supposed episodes had taken on him, painting himself as the patient ex-husband who had tried everything to help me. Vanessa added her own spin, sharing stories of me canceling plans last minute or skipping family events, twisting them into signs of deeper issues. The timing could not have been worse. I had just secured a meeting with the board of a mid-sized tech firm based in Colombia that was looking for a long-term financial consultant. I had spent months preparing my pitch, building rapport with their CFO, setting up what I thought was going to be my biggest contract to date. 2 days before the final meeting, I received a curt email thanking me for my time, but saying they had decided to pursue other arrangements. When I called the CFO, she hesitated before saying she had been advised to reconsider based on information she had heard from reliable sources. The words made my stomach turn. Reliable sources. I knew exactly who they meant. It did not stop there. 2 long-standing clients called within weeks to cancel their agreements. One of them, a couple I had helped navigate a difficult investment decision years earlier, apologized and said they needed someone more stable to manage their portfolio. I kept my voice steady on the phone, even managed to wish them well, but my hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down after we hung up. In Charleston, the business community was tight-knit. Once a story took root, it grew like kudzu, winding its way into every corner. Friends stopped inviting me to networking events. A neighbor who used to wave from her porch started avoiding eye contact. Even some relatives kept their distance, convinced by Vanessa's performance of the concerned sister who only wanted the best for me but had to be honest about my condition. I tried to fight it at first. I reached out to people I trusted, explained that yes, I had struggled during my marriage, but it was because I had discovered Ryan's infidelity, not because I was unstable. Some listened, others nodded politely while their eyes drifted away, the damage already done. One afternoon that winter, I ran into Vanessa at a boutique on King Street. She was looking at scarves, the picture of casual elegance. I had not seen her since the divorce. She smiled like we were old friends, asked how I was holding up. Her eyes glittered when she mentioned that Ryan had been so worried about me. I remember gripping the edge of the display table, nails digging into the wood. I said nothing, paid for the one item I had picked up, and walked out into the cold, her laughter following me through the door. Those months were the loneliest I had ever known. My work was my anchor, but even that felt unsteady. I kept my head down, focused on the few clients who had stayed, and rebuilt my days piece by piece. Nights were harder. I would lie awake listening to the distant hum of the city, thinking about how easily the truth could be drowned out by a louder lie. It was not just the loss of income that hurt. It was the realization that people I had known for years could be so easily swayed, that my reputation, something I had built with care, could be dismantled in weeks. That knowledge settled deep in my bones. By the time I started to regain my footing, I had changed. I no longer assumed people were on my side. I watched, I listened, and I learned how to let others underestimate me. It was a skill I had never wanted, but one I would use now without hesitation. Looking back, that period was the turning point. The money Vanessa and Ryan took mattered, but what they had done to my name was worse. They had made me a stranger in my own community, and that was not something I could forgive. Now, sitting in my quiet home years later with my grandmother's journal locked away, I could still feel the sting of those days. It was more than motivation. It was fuel. I thought about the faces of the people who had turned away and about the moment they would learn the truth. That would be worth far more than any contract I had lost. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows. I closed my laptop, stood, and walked to the desk. My fingers rested on the drawer that held the journal. Not yet, I thought. The time was coming, and when it did, I would not just reclaim what was mine. I would make sure they understood the cost of every lie they told. The invitation to meet came in the form of a short voicemail from Margaret Caldwell, her tone clipped but polite. She suggested we have lunch at the Mount Pleasant Country Club, a place I knew well from my years with Ryan. I agreed, though I doubted she wanted reconciliation. Margaret was a master at protecting her family's image, and if she was reaching out, it was because she thought she could control whatever story was unfolding. The drive over was quiet, the bridge stretching above the water glinting under a pale winter sun. The club looked the same as it always had, its white columns and manicured lawns projecting the kind of southern gentility Margaret prized. Inside, the dining room was warm, filled with the low murmur of members catching up over lunch. She was already seated at a corner table, posture straight, a cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders. "Claire," she said with a polite nod as I approached, her lips curving into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you for coming." I took the seat opposite her, setting my bag down beside me. I wondered if she noticed the way I angled it so the worn leather of my grandmother's journal inside would be hidden from view. The waiter appeared, took our drink orders, and retreated. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. "I think we can agree the last few years have been difficult for everyone. But I believe it's time to put certain matters to rest." I tilted my head, letting her continue. "Vanessa has been very generous in offering you a monthly allowance. It's more than fair considering the court's decision. I think it would be wise for you to accept it and move on. Family is family after all, and we need to maintain a certain decorum." Her words were smooth, but I could hear the steel beneath them. This was not about generosity. This was about keeping me quiet, making sure no one asked the wrong questions. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, "but I don't think money is the issue here." Her brows lifted slightly. "Then what is the issue?" I leaned back, letting a small pause stretch between us. "You know, Margaret, sometimes I think about how much Ryan must have struggled, balancing a marriage with me and other commitments. It couldn't have been easy." Her expression froze for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it away. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you are," I thought, but I didn't press. I sipped my water, watching her fingers tighten just slightly around her napkin. The waiter returned with our salads, breaking the tension. Margaret spoke about the club's upcoming charity event, the weather, anything but what I had just implied. I listened, offering polite responses, but my mind was busy cataloging every flicker of discomfort that crossed her face. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down. "I know you've been through a lot, Claire, but Vanessa and Ryan are building a life together. Dwelling on the past will only make things harder for you." I smiled faintly. "The past has a way of catching up whether we dwell on it or not." Her lips pressed together. She glanced toward the window where a group of golfers were laughing as they loaded their clubs into a cart. When she turned back, her tone was softer, but the warning was still there. "Think about the offer. It would give you stability, and it would avoid unpleasantness." Unpleasantness. As if what they had already done to me had been anything less. "I'll think about it," I said, pushing my plate away. "Thank you for lunch." We stood, and she reached for her purse. As we walked toward the exit, I caught her glancing at me, a quick measuring look as though trying to decide how much I knew. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of salt from the marsh beyond the course. I paused by my car, meeting her gaze one last time. "Margaret," I said quietly, "tell Ryan I wish him well. Balancing old habits with new vows can be tricky." Her eyes narrowed just slightly before she turned and walked to her own car. I watched her drive away, the image of her tight grip on the steering wheel fixed in my mind. The wind had picked up by the time I crossed the bridge back into Charleston, the water churning below. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the leather bag beside me. The journal inside felt heavier than usual, as if reminding me that its pages held more than numbers and property descriptions. They held the end of Vanessa and Ryan's little empire, and now I knew Margaret had just enough doubt in her mind to make her watch them more closely. The next morning I was on the road early, the sun just beginning to burn away the fog along Highway 17. The drive to Savannah had always been one of my favorites, the marshes stretching out on either side, the water glinting in places where the light caught it just right. Today the view barely registered. My focus was on the meeting ahead, on the man who held the keys to everything my grandmother had worked for. Martin Chen's office occupied the top floor of a historic brick building near Forsyth Park. The elevator opened directly into a reception area filled with warm wood and the faint scent of old paper. His assistant greeted me with a smile and led me down a short hallway to a spacious corner office where Martin stood waiting by the window. "Claire," he said, warmly extending his hand. "I am glad you reached out." We shook hands and I took the seat he indicated across from his desk. The leather journal was in my bag at my feet, but I kept it there for now. Martin settled into his chair and folded his hands. "I understand you have read through the documents," he began. I nodded. "Everything in that journal is more than I expected. $2 million in assets, all tucked away where no one could touch them without my consent, and you are the only one who knows." He allowed himself a small smile. "That was your grandmother's intention. She wanted to ensure her true estate would be protected from any opportunistic behavior. What Vanessa and Ryan took through the courts was never the heart of her wealth. The satisfaction of hearing it out loud was sharp but fleeting. Knowing the money was safe was one thing. Making them pay for what they had done was another. I need more than security," I said. "I need proof. Proof they lied, manipulated the court, and used falsified evidence." Martin's gaze sharpened. "That will require careful work. I have someone who might help." He picked up the phone on his desk, spoke briefly to his assistant, and within minutes the door opened. Derek Foster stepped inside, his smile widening when he saw me. "It has been too long, Claire," he said, taking a seat beside me. "Martin tells me you have a situation. Derek and I had met years ago at the College of Charleston. He had gone into civil law, building a reputation for uncovering fraud in contract disputes. If anyone could help untangle what Vanessa and Ryan had spun, it was him. I told them everything. The court hearings, the testimony about my supposed instability, the edited photographs, the way Vanessa had blocked me from seeing my grandmother in her final weeks." Derek listened without interrupting, his pen moving quickly over a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back. "The key will be documentation. Dates, witnesses, inconsistencies between their statements, and verifiable facts. We can subpoena certain records, but we will also need personal accounts from people who saw or heard them discuss their plan." Martin nodded. "Between the journal and what Derek can gather, we will have a foundation. But we must be patient. Vanessa and Ryan believe they have won. That is an advantage for us." I thought about Margaret's face yesterday at the country club, the flicker of uncertainty she tried to hide. They were not as untouchable as they thought. "What about the properties in the journal?" I asked. "If they discover the trust exists before we act, can they interfere?" "Not without your signature," Martin said. "And I will ensure the trust remains sealed until the moment we need it." Derek tapped his pen against the pad. "I will start with the court transcripts and their sworn affidavits. Any discrepancies between versions of their story could be useful. I also want to speak with anyone who is close to your grandmother in her last year." A name came to mind immediately. Janet Miller. She lived next door to my grandmother and had already hinted she knew more than she had said. "I can arrange that," I told him. "Good," Derek said. "The stronger our witness list, the harder it will be for them to dismiss the case as sour grapes." Martin glanced at the clock. "Claire, this will not be quick. But when the time comes, the impact will be decisive." I left the office with Derek's business card in my pocket and a folder from Martin containing copies of the trust documents. Outside, the air was milder than it had been in Charleston, the park alive with people walking dogs and sipping coffee. I walked slowly to my car, the sound of my heels on the brick sidewalk steady and measured. The ride back gave me time to think. Every mile between Savannah and Charleston felt like a step closer to the moment I had been waiting for. Vanessa and Ryan had taken my reputation, my place in the family, and tried to take my future. Now I had allies, and for the first time in years the balance was starting to shift in my favor. Janet Miller's house sat just beyond the white picket fence that separated my grandmother's property from the rest of the street. The paint was chipped in places, the porch swing swayed lightly in the breeze, and a row of potted geraniums lined the steps. I had called ahead, and she was waiting for me, a mug of tea in her hands and a curious look in her eyes. "Come in, dear," she said, holding the door open. The scent of cinnamon and something baking drifted through the air. I stepped into a cozy living room filled with framed photographs, the kind of place where every item had a story. We settled into 2 armchairs by the window. I told her I was looking into some things about my grandmother's final months, and I thought she might remember details others had overlooked. Janet took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze steady on mine. "I remember a lot, Claire," she said, finally. "More than I told anyone. You came by one afternoon, do you remember? It was warm late spring. You were carrying a bouquet of flowers." I nodded. I had picked them from the garden that morning. "Vanessa met you at the gate." Janet continued, her voice low. "She told you your grandmother was too tired for visitors. You tried to insist, but she stood there blocking the path. I was on my porch, and I could see the look on your face. You were hurt, but you didn't want to cause a scene." I felt the old frustration rise in my chest. That day had bothered me for months, but I had told myself maybe she was telling the truth, maybe my grandmother had needed rest. Janet set her cup down on the side table. That wasn't the only time. She started staying later and later, sometimes overnight. Ryan too. One night, about a week before your grandmother passed, I was watering my plants out back. The windows were open on her sunroom, and I heard voices from the porch. It was dark, but I recognized them. Vanessa and Ryan. She paused, her fingers curling slightly in her lap. "What did they say?" I asked. They were speaking quietly, but I caught pieces. Vanessa said something about needing to transfer the papers before it was too late. Ryan told her not to worry, that keeping you away was the most important part. Then they both laughed. The words landed heavy. Transfer the papers. Keep me away. It lined up too perfectly with what I had read in my grandmother's journal. The entries from those weeks had been meticulous, almost like she knew someone would try to challenge her. She had listed which documents were in which safe, which had been moved, and who knew about them. Janet leaned forward. "I didn't know what they meant, but it didn't feel right. And after your grandmother passed and all that court mess started, I wondered if I should have said something. You're saying it now," I told her. "That matters." She nodded slowly. "If you need me to tell this to a lawyer, I will. Your grandmother was a good woman. She deserved better than whatever games they were playing." I thanked her, and we talked a while longer about small things, the neighborhood, how quiet the street had become since my grandmother's house stood empty. Before I left, Janet disappeared into another room and returned with a small envelope. "I found this in my mailbox around that time," she said, handing it to me. "No return address, just my name." Inside was a photocopy of some legal document. I didn't understand it, so I tucked it away. Maybe it's important. I slipped the envelope into my bag without opening it. Outside, the late afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the lawn. Back in my car, I sat for a moment, the steering wheel warm under my hands. Janet's words replayed in my mind. "Transfer the papers. Keep me away." The image of Vanessa standing at the gate came back sharp and clear, her smile tight, her body angled to block my path. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice every small sound, the hum of the tires, the click of the turn signal. At home, I carried the envelope to my desk, setting it next to the leather journal. 2 pieces of a puzzle that was starting to take shape. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. Somewhere across town, Vanessa and Ryan probably thought the world was still tilting in their favor. But now I had a witness. And soon I would have more. Lydia Harrow picked up on the first ring, her voice bright with the same energy she had in high school. I told her I needed to meet, no small talk, just a place and time. We ended up at a small diner off East Bay Street, the kind that smelled faintly of coffee and fried eggs, no matter the hour. She slid into the booth across from me, a pen already in her hand. "You sound like someone who's sitting on a story," she said, tilting her head. I gave her the condensed version. Vanessa, Ryan. The inheritance, the lies. I left out the trust for now. Lydia listened without interrupting, only scribbling notes here and there. When I finished, she leaned back and tapped her pen against the table. "I've been hearing whispers about Ryan for months," she said. "Something about a land deal in Savannah that smelled bad. Zoning changes, kickbacks, friends in the right offices." My stomach tightened. "Could you prove it?" "Maybe not all of it, but I can make people start asking questions," she said with a small smile. 2 days later, Lydia's byline ran in the Sunday edition of the Charleston Sentinel. The headline was careful, almost polite on the surface, but the subtext was sharp. A prominent Savannah developer tied to a controversial waterfront project. Anonymous sources questioning whether permits had been rushed. The article never mentioned Ryan by name, but anyone who knew the local real estate scene could connect the dots. I bought 2 copies of the paper and read it twice over coffee. Lydia had threaded the needle perfectly. Enough fact to avoid retraction, enough suggestion to make people lean in. By that evening, the online version had racked up hundreds of comments, speculation running wild. The effect was immediate. I started hearing from old acquaintances who hadn't called me in years. "Did you see that article? Isn't that your ex-husband?" The questions weren't always direct, but the undertone was clear. People were talking. A friend who worked at the Harborview Hotel texted me that Ryan and Vanessa had been spotted there meeting with their event planner. They were still moving forward with their engagement party. I pictured them in the hotel's glass-walled conference room, smiling at floral arrangements and menu options, pretending the world outside wasn't shifting. The following afternoon, I stopped by Lydia's office. She was at her desk, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, flipping through a stack of printouts. She motioned for me to wait, then hung up. "You'd be surprised how many people want to talk when they smell a scandal," she said. "I've had 3 calls about Ryan in the last hour. One from a contractor who says he got stiffed on payment. Another from someone in zoning who swears the permit approvals were rushed." I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Public opinion was a current you couldn't see, but you could feel it when it shifted against someone. Ryan had always prided himself on being untouchable, the kind of man who could walk into any room and be welcomed. That was about to change. Later that week, I stopped by the market near Waterfront Park. 2 women stood by the produce section, their heads close together, speaking in the low, excited tone people use when they know a secret. I caught one name in their conversation. Caldwell. They didn't notice me. The pressure built slowly, like water behind a dam. Vanessa and Ryan's social media feeds, once full of carefully curated images of vacations and charity events, grew quieter. A single photo of them at a fundraiser drew comments that had nothing to do with the cause. By Friday, Lydia called with an update. "They're scrambling," she said. "Ryan's trying to reassure his partners, but the whispers are louder now. And I think Vanessa's starting to feel it. She's been calling around to mutual friends, trying to find out who talked to me." "Good," I said. "Let her wonder." That night, I walked along the Battery, the water dark and restless under the moonlight. The air was cool enough to carry the faint sound of music from one of the restaurants down the street. In my mind, I could see the 2 of them at their engagement party, the polite smiles, the clinking glasses. And underneath the awareness that the ground wasn't as solid as it had been a month ago. It was only the beginning. Martin's call came just after breakfast, his tone measured but with a deliberate pause that made me set my coffee cup down. The quarterly statement had been delivered to First Atlantic Bank, and in his words, there was nothing in it that they can actually touch. I didn't need more explanation. That was the moment Ethan Parker, their trusted banker and Ryan's longtime friend, would see the truth. Every cent they thought they had was bound by the trust locked behind my signature, and on paper it looked like a hollow shell dressed up in investment language. I imagined the chain reaction. Ethan sitting at his desk with the morning light spilling over stacks of files, flipping through the pages, his brow tightening. A phone call to Ryan, maybe a hesitant "we should talk," followed by the first ripple of panic. Panic would spread faster in their world than any rumor ever could. I spent the late morning moving through the house, letting the quiet stretch. Every so often, I would glance toward the front gate, not expecting them just yet, but knowing they'd come. By noon, I was sure Ryan had paced his office enough to wear grooves in the floor. Vanessa, I pictured her sitting in their kitchen, perfectly styled, even in crisis, trying to convince herself it was all a misunderstanding. By 3 o'clock, the sound of tires crunching over my gravel drive broke the calm. I stepped to the window. First came Ryan's black SUV, dust trailing behind it like smoke. Then Vanessa's gleaming white coupe pulling in too quickly, the tires spitting tiny stones onto the grass. They didn't pause before climbing out. Ryan's jaw was set, hard shoulders squared, his steps long and fast toward the porch. Vanessa's heels clicked sharp against the stone path, her face a mix of anger and fear. They were already talking over each other before they even reached the steps. The pounding on the door started almost immediately, a rapid, impatient rhythm that reverberated through the entryway. "Claire, open the door," Ryan barked. "We need to talk." I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall beside the door. The air inside was still and cool, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own breathing. Vanessa's voice followed, higher, more urgent. "This is ridiculous. You're making a scene." A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. I kept my tone steady as I called back through the door. $2 million was never sitting in that account. And now you know. The pounding stopped. "Claire," Ryan started again, but his voice had shifted, softening, trying to pivot. "Look, we can figure this out. The last time you figured anything out about me, I said you stood in court and told a judge I was unstable so you could take what wasn't yours. That was different." Vanessa cut in, her voice tight. "We were trying to do what was best for everyone." "Everyone?" I asked. "Or just the two of you?" There was a pause, then the sound of their voices dropping, low, hurried whispers between them. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. It was the sound of people who realized the story they had been telling the world didn't match the one written in black and white at the bank. Vanessa tried again. "Let us in. We can talk privately." I looked around the entryway at the sunlight spilling across the old hardwood floors my grandmother had polished herself. This was my space now, my home, and their urgency wasn't about repairing relationships. It was about access, about control slipping through their fingers. "You should leave," I said evenly. "There's nothing for you here." More pounding, this time sharper, Ryan's frustration breaking through. "You think you can keep this up forever?" I didn't answer. I stepped back from the door and walked toward the living room, their voices muffled but still tense outside. I could hear the edge in Ryan's tone, the way Vanessa's words tripped over themselves, each trying to dominate the other. They were losing the image they cared about most, the calm, collected couple who always had the upper hand. Minutes passed before the engines started again. I watched from the window as Ryan pulled out first, his SUV lurching slightly as he hit the gas. Vanessa followed close behind, her car's tires spinning briefly on the gravel before catching traction. The dust hung in the air long after they were gone. I stayed by the window until the road was empty. The quiet that settled afterward wasn't just peace. It was the pause between the first crack and the full collapse. On the coffee table, the journal sat where I had left it, its worn leather cover catching the afternoon light. I picked it up, feeling the weight in my hands. Those pages held every piece of what they thought they had stolen, every asset, every detail. But they also held the truth, and the truth was about to be shared in a place where there would be no shouting through doors, no whispered negotiations. The next move wouldn't be here in my home. It would be in a bank conference room under bright lights with witnesses and documents they couldn't twist into something else. And when that moment came, they would understand this was never just about the money. It was about showing them exactly how it feels when the ground you stand on disappears beneath you. I set the journal down again, the leather warm from my hands, and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. It was almost time. The call from Martin came early the next morning, his voice clipped and direct. First Atlantic Bank had scheduled an emergency meeting for Thursday afternoon in their downtown Charleston branch. Everyone involved would be there. That included me, Martin, Vanessa, Ryan, their attorney Ethan, and Margaret Caldwell. Martin's tone made it clear this was not going to be a polite conversation. By the time I walked into the bank's glass-walled conference room, the air already carried that sharp, tense quiet that settles in when people know the stakes. The blinds were half drawn against the bright sun, casting stripes across the polished table. At one end sat Ethan, his hands folded tightly on the stack of papers in front of him. Beside him, Ryan leaned back in his chair, trying for casual but failing. His jaw worked every few seconds as if he were grinding down whatever words he wanted to say. Vanessa sat rigid, her blazer immaculate, but the color in her cheeks betrayed the effort it took to keep her expression neutral. Margaret was there too, in a dark tailored suit, her hands clasped around a leather folder. She gave me a brief nod when I entered, the kind that was more acknowledgement than greeting. I took the seat next to Martin, who was already arranging a neat line of documents along the table's edge. The bank's senior manager, a man named Harold Whitmore, opened the meeting. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved quickly from one face to the next. We're here to address discrepancies related to the Caldwell Trust assets and the loan approved earlier this year. Ethan, you are the account manager of record. Can you explain how this loan was processed based on assets that as of this week have been identified as unverified? Ethan shifted in his chair, his voice tight. At the time of the application, I was provided with documentation showing ownership and valuation consistent with the requirements. Those documents were convincing. His glance flicked toward Ryan for a fraction of a second before moving back to Harold. Martin leaned forward, sliding a folder toward the center of the table. Convincing because they were altered. This is the original trust statement from my office dated before Mrs. Eleanor Rosewood passed. And this, he placed a second sheet beside it, is the version submitted to the bank. You can see the property valuations were inflated, the language adjusted, to suggest the trust could be accessed without joint consent from both beneficiaries. That is false. Vanessa let out a small, quick laugh that was meant to sound dismissive but landed brittle. You can't prove where that second document came from. Yes, Martin said calmly, I can. The metadata on the file shows it was created on a laptop registered to your residence, Mrs. Caldwell. It was emailed to Ethan from your husband's personal address. The room went still. Ryan's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Martin wasn't finished. He pulled another folder from his bag. We also have sworn statements. Janet Miller, a neighbor of Mrs. Rosewood, has testified she overheard the two of you discussing the need to move the papers before it was too late and to keep Claire from seeing her grandmother in her final days. That testimony aligns with my own notes from the trust meetings when Mrs. Rosewood expressed concern about certain pressures she was feeling from family members. Vanessa's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came out. Her face had gone pale, the flush gone from her cheeks entirely. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice low but carrying across the table. Is this true? She asked, looking directly at Ryan. Ryan shifted in his chair. Mom, it's not as bad as it sounds. We were trying to what Margaret's tone sharpened. To take what wasn't yours. To drag the family name into a bank investigation, Harold stepped in, his expression grave. If this is accurate, the bank has been misled into approving a loan against non-liquid, jointly held assets. That is a serious breach both legally and in terms of internal compliance. Ethan's voice was quieter now. I trusted the documents I was given. I didn't realize. He trailed off, rubbing a hand across his mouth. Martin tapped the table lightly, drawing the attention back to him. Whether you realized or not, the fact remains. The trust is intact. It cannot be accessed without both beneficiaries' consent. Any loan predicated on sole ownership is voidable and potentially actionable. Vanessa finally found her voice, though it trembled at the edges. So what now? You think you can just walk away with everything? I met her gaze evenly. This isn't about walking away. It's about putting back what you tried to take. And about the truth, which is now very clear to everyone in this room. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muted traffic outside. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on her son, a look that carried something heavier than anger. Disappointment, maybe even shame. Harold began to gather the scattered papers in front of him. We will be conducting a full review. If the evidence supports what's been presented here, the loan will be rescinded and the matter may be referred to the appropriate authorities. Martin closed his folders with deliberate precision. That will be our next step as well. Vanessa sat back, her arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the table. Ryan didn't look at me once as the meeting drew to a close. As we stood, Margaret walked past me toward the door. She paused just long enough to say, "You were right to bring this forward," before stepping into the hallway. I watched her go, the tension still sharp in the air, knowing the weight of what had been said would not fade quickly. This was no longer just a family feud. It was on record now, carved into official minutes and bank files impossible to rewrite. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding against the glass facade of the building. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the heat rising from the concrete, and felt the first real shift in the balance. The truth had been spoken in the one place they couldn't shout it down, and now the consequences would begin to take shape. The following morning, Martin called again, his tone calm but edged with finality. He told me the bank had agreed to reconvene in a smaller setting, just the principal parties and their attorneys, to determine a resolution. It was our moment to decide how this would end, and I intended to make sure the terms were mine. We met in a private conference room on the top floor of the bank. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the Charleston harbor in the distance. The air was still, almost heavy, as if the room itself understood that whatever happened here would not be undone. Vanessa sat at the far end of the table, her hair pulled into a sleek twist, eyes fixed on some point beyond the glass. Ryan was beside her, flipping the cap of his pen open and closed. Margaret sat between them, her posture rigid but her gaze sharper than either of theirs. Martin took the seat next to me, placing a slim leather portfolio in front of him. Across the table, their attorney adjusted his cufflinks and tried for a neutral expression. When Harold from the bank gave a brief nod, I leaned forward and spoke. "You have a choice. You can sign this statement acknowledging your role in falsifying trust documents and obstructing my access to Mrs. Rosewood before her death. That statement will remain sealed unless the agreed repayment is not made. Or you can refuse, and I will pursue criminal charges, civil damages, and allow the press to run the story in full detail." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You think you can blackmail us into this?" I met his eyes without flinching. "It's not blackmail. It's an opportunity to limit the damage you've already done. The bank will agree to apply the trust funds toward closing out the outstanding loan, but only if both beneficiaries sign the release. Without that, you're facing not only the bank's lawyers, but mine and the district attorney's office. And the court of public opinion will not be kind." Vanessa finally looked at me, her face pale but her voice sharp. "You drag our names through the mud just to feel like you won. You did that yourselves," I said quietly. Martin slid the document toward their attorney, who began reading it, his brow furrowing. "The language is clear. If my clients sign, they agree to the repayment terms and the acknowledgement of misconduct. The statement is held by both legal counsels and is only released if the terms are breached." Margaret leaned toward Ryan, her voice low but audible in the stillness. "Sign it, before it's too late." Vanessa's hands were clenched in her lap. For a long moment she didn't move, then she reached for the pen. Her fingers trembled so hard she had to steady the page with her other hand. She signed in slow, deliberate strokes, the sound of the pen scratching on paper loud in the quiet room. Ryan stared at the document for several seconds, then picked up the pen. He signed quickly, almost carelessly, not looking at anyone. When he set the pen down, he leaned back and crossed his arms. I kept my eyes on Vanessa. "One more thing, the ring. It was my grandmother's, and it belongs with me. You can hand it over here in front of the bank and your attorney, or I can list it as stolen property in the statement we just signed." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but Margaret's hand closed over her arm. Without a word, Vanessa reached into her purse and took out the velvet box. She pushed it across the table, her nails tapping the lid once before letting go. I opened it just enough to see the familiar curve of gold, the deep green of the emerald, and then closed it again. I placed the box in front of me and folded my hands over it. The attorney gathered the signed pages, sliding them into a folder. This concludes the matter for now. Provided the repayment terms are met, the statement remains confidential. Margaret rose first, her chair scraping softly against the carpet. She looked at me for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod before walking toward the door. Ryan followed without looking back. Vanessa was last, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound fading until the door closed behind them. For the first time in months, I felt the weight in my chest ease. The ring was back in my possession. The truth was on paper and the control was mine again. I slipped the velvet box into my bag, feeling its small weight as if it were a stone anchoring me. Martin packed his portfolio, his voice low. "That was the cleanest end you were going to get." "It's not the end," I said, standing and adjusting the strap on my bag. "It's the terms, and they were mine." We left the room together, stepping into the bright hallway where the hum of the bank's daily business carried on as if nothing had happened. But I knew, as did everyone in that room, that something had shifted permanently. By the time I stepped out into the afternoon heat, the harbor breeze cutting through the air, the velvet box was still in my hand. The emerald caught a sliver of sunlight as I turned it over once, then closed my fingers around it and kept walking. I drove straight to the old house on Rosewood Lane, the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled into the driveway. The shutters were closed, the air heavy with that late summer stillness that seemed to settle over Charleston in August. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the faint scent of lemon oil and old paper wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. The library was just as I remembered it. The sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with leather-bound books and framed photographs of a life well lived. I walked to the oak desk, the one where my grandmother had sat countless times, her pen scratching over letters and notes. I set my bag down and took out the velvet box. With slow, deliberate movements, I slipped the emerald ring onto my finger. It felt cool at first, then warmer as it settled into place, as if it had been waiting for me. In the top drawer, tucked beneath a stack of envelopes, was the one I had never opened. My name was written across it in her neat cursive. My fingers hesitated for a moment before I slid them under the flap and pulled out the letter inside. Her handwriting was steady, the ink a deep blue. She wrote that the $2 million was never just about money. It was a test of character, a measure of who could be trusted when the stakes were high and the temptations stronger than loyalty. She told me I had passed not because I had won in the legal sense, but because I had held my ground without losing myself. I read those words twice, letting them settle into me. Memories rose up like tidewater. The nights I spent defending myself against lies, the humiliation of watching people I loved turn away, the cold silence of family dinners when I was no longer part of their circle. Every loss had been a bruise that took years to fade. But now, sitting in the chair she had once occupied, I understood something I had missed before. This wasn't only about reclaiming what had been stolen. It was about proving to her and to myself that I was still the person she believed in. I leaned back and let my eyes roam the room. The portraits on the walls, the shelves lined with first editions, the heavy drapes that muffled the outside world. It was all part of her legacy, and now it was mine to shape. The idea came quietly at first, then settled in with a kind of certainty I couldn't ignore. The money could do more than just close a chapter in my life. It could open one for someone else. Young women who had faced the same kind of obstacles I had, who needed a door held open when everyone else was shutting them out. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, I had a name in my head. The Rosewood Scholarship Fund. It would be for female students from South Carolina with financial need and the kind of determination that doesn't crack under pressure. It would carry my grandmother's name forward, not as a reminder of wealth, but as a symbol of resilience. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the desk and began sketching ideas. Endowment terms, application requirements, the kind of mentorship programs it could support. I could almost hear her voice in the back of my mind, the same tone she used when telling me to think bigger, to never settle for the first solution that came to mind. When I finally set my pen down, the house had grown quiet in that way it always did at dusk. The air felt lighter, the weight on my chest replaced by something steadier. I stood and crossed the room to the window, looking out over the lawn where the azaleas had long since bloomed and faded. The ring caught the fading light, the emerald deep and steady. I touched it once more, a small gesture of promise, and turned away from the window. The letter lay open on the desk, her words still visible. For the first time in years, I felt not just victorious, but at peace. I had taken back the money, the truth, and my place in the story. Now it was time to decide what kind of story it would become for someone else. Autumn settled in with that slow Charleston hush, the kind that turns live oaks darker and draws the air in close. I spent the first weeks after the meeting doing quiet work. Martin filed the final documents with the bank. The signed statement went into 2 sealed folders, one in his office in Savannah and one in a safe deposit box under my name. Ethan kept his head down. Harold sent a short letter confirming the loan reversal and the schedule for repayment using the trust's designated mechanisms, all contingent on my consent. Each page felt like closing a door with a firm hand. At the house on Rosewood Lane, I opened windows, let the late light spill across the floors, and made a list on the old oak desk. Create a board for the scholarship. Draft the endowment structure. Reach out to mentors. I called Martin and asked him to serve as a trustee. He said he would be honored. I called an old professor at the College of Charleston who had once told me I had a talent for making complicated things simple. She agreed to help read applications when the time came. I called a guidance counselor at a public high school in North Charleston who knew which girls were carrying more than their book bags. News about Ryan and Vanessa did not come all at once. It drifted in through the same channels that had carried the rumors years earlier, only quieter this time, as if people were careful not to say too much out loud. Their engagement party disappeared from the Harborview calendar. A developer conference in Savannah moved Ryan's panel to a different slot and replaced his name with another. A brand partnership stopped appearing on Vanessa's social feed. The smiles in their photos looked tighter. The comments underneath looked colder. One afternoon in late October, I drove past their condo on Bay Street and saw a moving truck idling at the curb. A man in a uniform wheeled out a stack of boxes, each labeled with neat black letters. Another carried a garment rack shrouded in plastic. I kept driving. The marsh on the other side of the bridge was bright with that pale autumn sun, and for the first time I did not feel the need to turn and look back. A week later, a mutual friend texted a single line. They split, no dramatics. No announcement. Just the quiet unraveling that comes when the foundation gives way. I felt no thrill, only a sense of symmetry. Choices bear weight. Eventually that weight finds you. By December, the city was dressed in lights and wreaths. The house felt softer with the smell of pine and cinnamon. A small stack of mail waited on the entry table. Tucked between a charity catalog and a holiday newsletter was a card with Margaret Caldwell's return address. I stood for a long moment before opening it. The front showed a watercolor of a winter churchyard. Inside was a short note written in her steady hand. She thanked me for handling an ugly matter with more grace than it deserved, and wished me peace in the new year. I thought of the look she had given me in the hallway outside the first bank meeting, a look that said she understood more than she was willing to say aloud. I placed the card in the desk drawer with my grandmother's letter and felt something ease inside me. The scholarship took shape the way a photograph appears in a tray, slowly at first and then all at once. The Rosewood Scholarship Fund became a document with signatures and a tax ID, then a website with a plain white page and a simple promise. It would support young women from South Carolina who had faced significant obstacles and who showed the kind of resolve that does not fade under pressure. Mentorship would be part of it, not just money. The first award would be made in the spring. On a cool evening just before Christmas, I walked the halls of the old house with a small toolbox, tightening a loose hinge, dusting the frames of family photographs, setting out the silver tray my grandmother loved during holidays. I paused in the library and touched the emerald ring, turning it once. The stone looked like captured pine light. I thought about the night Vanessa flashed it across a cafe, and the morning I slid it back onto my own hand at this very desk. The circle felt complete without feeling closed. The story had a next page. Winter drew in and the city grew quiet in the way coastal towns do after visitors leave. I drove out to Folly Beach on New Year's Day and stood with my shoes in my hand, the cold surf rushing in over my toes. I breathed in the salt and let the wind pull at my hair. When I turned back, the line my feet had made was already washing away. It felt right to leave no mark there. Spring came early. Azaleas burst pink across front yards and the air turned warm and soft. On a bright Saturday in April, the first scholarship ceremony took place in a small auditorium at the College of Charleston. Rows of folding chairs, a podium borrowed from the alumni office, a string quartet of students playing softly near the back. Martin sat on the aisle, his hands folded, a small smile in place. My former professor gave a brief introduction that made me blush, then it was my turn. I stood at the podium and looked at the faces in the room. Parents gripping programs, teachers with proud eyes, students shifting in their seats with restless hope. On the front row sat a young woman named Maya from North Charleston, a senior who wanted to study engineering. She had balanced school, a part-time job, and caring for a younger brother. Her application was neat and unadorned, her words spare and true. The scholarship would cover her first year. Mentorship would help carry her further. I spoke about the meaning of integrity. Not as a line on a brochure, but as a daily choice that no one may see you make. I spoke about the way loss can clarify what matters. I spoke about my grandmother without naming the battles we had fought to honor her wishes. I told them that money could pay a bill, but character keeps a promise. I told them that sometimes the road to what is right is not straight, but it is worth walking anyway. Afterward, Maya came up to the front with her mother. Her hands trembled when she shook mine. She said she would not waste what had been given. I believed her. When the photographs were finished and the chairs were being stacked, I stepped to the side and pressed my fingers to the emerald. I could almost feel my grandmother's hand on my shoulder, that steady weight that had always said keep going. News of Ryan and Vanessa reached me in fragments over the next months. He relocated to Atlanta for a position with a smaller firm. She moved west for a while to help a cousin with a boutique marketing project. Their names faded from Charleston conversations, the way summer storms disappear beyond the horizon, noisy at first and then gone. I did not look for them. I did not block their shadows either. I simply lived. By summer, the Scholarship Advisory Board met monthly in the library. Martin brought pastries from a bakery near Forsyth Park. My professor brought a stack of essays with notes in the margins. We argued kindly about applicants, and then agreed. I began to like the sound of laughter in rooms that had once held only silence. I began to like the feel of afternoons when the only urgent thing on my list was to write a thank you note to a donor. On a quiet evening in July, I sat on the front steps as dusk collected in the trees. Fireflies stitched light across the lawn. Somewhere down the street, a radio played a song that felt like the year turning a corner. I thought about everything that had broken and everything that had been rebuilt. I thought about the words in my grandmother's letter. It was a test of character. It was a measure of who could be trusted. I understood them now in the way you only understand after you have walked through fire and found that your name still belongs to you. This is where the story settles for me. Not in a courtroom and not in a headline, but in the quiet return of things that matter. The house is in order. The trust is secure. The ring sits where it should. The scholarship has a first recipient and a waiting list behind her. The people who tried to take what was not theirs are living elsewhere, carrying the weight of their choices. And I am here steady in the place my grandmother loved, choosing each day to be the person she believed I could be. If you have ever watched someone twist the truth and wondered if it would ever unwind, let this ending sit with you. Sometimes justice walks, not runs. Sometimes the most powerful answer is patience gathered with purpose. If this story touched something you know, share your thoughts with me. Tell me where you found your strength. Leave a note so others can find it too. If you want more stories about finding your footing and holding your ground, stay with me, add your voice, and be part of the circle that keeps choosing integrity.